Well, welcome everyone. I have two things I really need to accomplish today, and one of them is we've been doing this series called Restore for several weeks now, and we're closing it out today, and I'm hoping just to lock it down and send you out with some things to help restore your souls. Because in case you haven't been with us, the whole premise of the Restore series is really going through 2020. We all know that it was rough on most of us for lots of different reasons. And we're just asking the question, how can you intentionally put yourself in a place where you're put back together on the inside? And we've been talking about that. So I want to lock down a few key ideas and send you out with those. Now, the second thing is this, is the story that we're getting into from Jesus' life, because that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at his life and learning how to restore our souls through that. The story we're getting into today is just one of those things that is so filled with meaning and so profound, it's really hard to figure out exactly what angle to take and how much time to spend on it. So what I'm going to do, though, is we're going to look at it through the lens of the question of how can my soul be restored? And here's how the story goes. It's found in Luke chapter 9. It begins at verse 28. Some 8 days after these sayings, he, speaking of Jesus, took along Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. And as these were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses, one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Then a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things that they had seen. Now, I don't think I introduced it with exaggeration, saying this is a story that is just got meaning, this layer after layer after layer after layer. But let's look at it through the lens of just this whole question of how can my soul be restored? And so I want to pass on a few things to you today as we're just kind of getting into this time. Okay, what does it really look like to be restored? And the first thing is this: if you want to be restored, plan prayerful rest. Plan prayerful rest. Now, we need to remember the flow of history, the flow of time that's happened that leads up to this story. Because this passage actually starts with, it says 8 days after these sayings. Well, if you hit the rewind button, you go back to some of the things that we've talked about. We're watching Jesus' life. We're just kind of learning how to be restored through watching him. One of the key things that he does is he starts off, he's healing people, and he's teaching, and he's preaching, and he's driving out demons. We see this all the time. But at one point he stops, and he tells his disciples, these 12 men that he's training, he says, "I'm going to give you the power to go out and do these very same things. You're going to heal, you're going to cast out demons, and then you're going to preach and teach." Well, he sends them out, and they're gone probably for a few weeks, and then they come back. And then I want to read what Mark, and we've talked about this before a few weeks back. I want to read what the Gospel of Mark says when they come back, what happened. It says, "The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that he had done and taught. And he said to them," listen what Jesus' words are, come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while. And then a parenthetical statement, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in a boat to a secluded place by themselves. And then watch what happens. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all cities and got there ahead of him. So keep in mind, here's what happens. They come back, they're real excited, but there's so many people around, you can't even make it to the counter to fix a sandwich. And Jesus says to them, you know what? You guys need to go away and get some rest. So they go away to get some rest. But the problem is that the crowd sees them doing that. They interrupt the whole thing. And that's where we saw is that the famous feeding of the 5,000 happens. It was an interruption to the vacation that Jesus had promised them, really. So then what Jesus does is he was interrupted, which can happen, by the way, even it happened to Jesus. But he takes them 30 miles north to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And I think it was him giving back that time of rest that he had promised. He takes them up to Caesarea Philippi because it's a place that was mainly populated by non-Jewish people. It wouldn't have been a place where the Jewish crowds would have followed him as much, and it was 30 miles away, so it was a little rougher. And they go up there, and then last week what we saw was that Jesus asked them a couple questions. He says, who do the crowds say I am? Who are the people saying I am? And then he turns it around and he said, now who do you say I am? And they identify him. And then this passage said, about 8 days after that. Now, we're not told what happened in the 8 days. We don't know. It might have been a bunch of nothings. It might have been a bunch of some things. But most likely, it involved this rest that he was talking about that they had done for a while. Because one of the indicators is, as the story goes, is that after the 8 days, Jesus picks out 3 of those 12, which I'd be kind of jealous. I was one of the remaining 9, He picks out 3 of them, Peter, James, and John. And what does he do? It says he took them up on a mountain to pray. Incidentally, I've always said, and we've done these surveys before, there are 2 kinds of people in life. There are beach people and there are mountain people. And this is proof from the Bible that Jesus was a mountain person. Okay, so he goes up on the mountain to get rest. He takes them up there, and what does he take them up there to do? He takes them up there to pray. That's why they were going up there. Now, one of the things that I fear whenever I'm teaching or preaching is I fear cliches. I fear just kind of saying what is the most obvious thing of all. But I shouldn't fear it too much because here's the deal, is that if you want to be restored, the greatest person who ever lived in the history of the planet, the one Christian orthodoxy said is God walking around as a person in the flesh, revealing who he is. What did he do when he said, I want you to get away, you need rest? What did he have them do? He took them up on a mountain because he's a mountain guy, but he took them up to do what? To pray. Prayer was a regular part of his life, and he was training his followers that prayer needed to be a part of their lives as a part of a necessary thing that happens in your heart. Now, here's the cliche that I fear. The message that I'm giving you is not, hey, you guys need to pray more, because that can often be kind of a source of guilt or whatever else. That's not what I said. I said, if you want your soul to be restored, plan prayerful rest. And that's different. That's not just something that's saying you need to pray more. It's actually sitting back and saying, if I want my soul to get to a different place, if it's kind of shredded from going through some things, I need to sit down with my calendar. I need to look at the budget of time that I have, and I need to say, this 15 minutes out of the day or a half hour or whatever else it is going to be focused on prayer. And then maybe once a week or once a month or once a quarter, I'm going to get away. I'm going to take a larger chunk of time, and I'm going to pray. So the Huffington Post is not exactly Christianity Today as far as a publication go. That's not kind of where they're coming from philosophically. They had an article called Why People Who Pray Are Healthier Than Those Who Don't. And it says this, reporter says, if you want to achieve maximum health, here are a few things that you should do. Exercise regularly. Eat nutritious and minimally processed foods. We all know that. Drop the extra pounds. Sorry to bring that up. And, according to them, pray. That's right, this reporter writes. Regular prayer and meditation has been shown in numerous scientific studies to be an important factor in living longer and staying healthy. And you can do that. Just put in health benefits of prayer in Google, and you'll see article after article after article, scientific research type of stuff that comes up that talks about this. Let me give you one example. The American Journal of Epidemiology out of Johns Hopkins University, they published a paper by a Harvard researcher where they researched this whole thing of young people praying. What are the health benefits? This is what they say, quote, compared with never praying or meditating, daily prayer practice was associated, according to their research, greater positive effect, emotional processing, and emotional expression, greater in all those categories than people who don't pray. Great, again, and get this, greater volunteering, a greater sense of mission, and more forgiveness, lower likelihoods of drug use. It was also possibly associated with greater satisfaction and self-esteem. I like this one. Greater likelihood of being registered to vote, do with that what you will, fewer depressive moments, and a lower risk of cigarette smoking. So prayer is one of those things, the greatest life who ever walked on the earth. It's another case of so many that the Bible tells you to do stuff, then in the end, God knows you're wired for, that you're not just, it's about communing with God ultimately, but it also has been proven to have all these other effects. And if you want your soul restored, that's what you need to do. And again, I'm talking about planning prayer. I had a friend of mine, I told you a few weeks back that I had rented an Airbnb down in Cadiz, Kentucky, and just to do that, I got alone in a cabin down there and just spent the couple days in prayer and fasting and things. And there's a friend of mine from our church, he said, I really want to encourage you to do that because I can tell it helps you and that helps us. So yes, he probably picked up on that. Now I know I'm in a season of in my life when I can do that. I remember the time when we had our kids were little and things were a lot busier. You may not be able to get away for a couple days. But here's what I do promise you, that if you will sit down and you will think of planned prayer, restful prayer, if you will do that, you can find that. Maybe it's just a couple of hours, but a special time where you can just get away and it reorients life in 1,000 different ways. Now here's what I also can tell you, is that I want to challenge you to do one thing. As we've been talking about Restore, we've also been pointing to resources because I don't want you to just kind of hear me say this stuff and then walk away and life isn't any different. So I want you to look at your calendar and try to find daily places, maybe a monthly place, plan some kind of special prayer retreat in your life. But the other thing I want to ask you to do is that on our resource page, on our app and on our website, we keep saying we provide resources. There's a thing called a spiritual pathways assessment. And what it is it takes like 5 to 10 minutes to do, unless you overthink every question, which you shouldn't, is it helps you to understand the kind of things that you need to have a meaningful connection with God. Some of us, mine came up, I needed intellectual stimulation and nature. That was kind of what it told me. And that's very, very true. Right now, I got this book about science and history and Christianity and stuff, and I'm realizing how much that stuff just really, really gets inside of me. Now, some of you, when you hear me say that, you're like, man, I'd rather be electrocuted than to have to do something like, you need a completely other things to connect with God. And so what I want to ask you to do is after the services are let out, if you can, remain behind and sit in your chair, go to our app, go to our website, and just fill out that little survey, and it'll give you a little bit of indication of how you can plan to do that. I'm going to ask you to do that personally if you want to be restored in your life. But here's another thing, and I can't tell you exactly what we're going to come up with, but we're really thinking as a staff, we're rethinking our whole environment of how can we plan prayerful rest? How can we plan prayerful rest as a part of our culture? And we're going to try to do some adjustments to just how we do life as a church so we can have an ongoing restorative kind of things happen in our life. So plan prayerful rest. The second thing is this. Remember, if you want to be restored, remember that you're dust. What in the world does that mean? Well, some of you may know that this isn't from the passage in Luke that we just read, but it is borrowed from Psalm 103. Listen to what it says. Just as a father has compassion on his children, So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he himself knows our frame. He is mindful that we are but dust. Now here's why this comes up. One of my favorite things about reading about Jesus' life and watching him in action and learning about him is he is juxtaposed by his followers, the disciples. And his disciples are us, really. They're so human. And one of the reasons I believe this story that we just read, even though it's really, really supernatural and kind of almost mythological and sounding, it's reported out so down to earth by the people that reported it. It's very, very believable. What do you mean juxtaposed by his disciples? It means that you've got Jesus doing all these amazing things. We're learning about the greatest person who's ever lived, and he's doing miracles, and he's having compassion, and he's forgiving people, and he's teaching, and he's in these in-depth philosophical and religious debates kind of stuff going on. He's this admirable character. And in the meantime, you've got his disciples that are like us. Because keep in mind, what was going on here? It says he went up on the mountain to pray. He picked those three guys. He said, I want you guys to go up on this mountain with me to do what? To pray. Now listen again what the passage actually says. I'm just going to read it. It won't be on the screen. It says, and while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure, which was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. This is a heavy, heavy, heavy moment. Then it says, now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep. But when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. I love the addition of that. I love that. So in other words, Jesus himself took them up on the mountain to pray. And what were they doing? The implication is all of this stuff with the bright shining light and all that started happening while these guys are sleeping. They were up there to pray and they were sleeping. Isn't that refreshing? Isn't that fun to know about? Because not only that, you can fast forward the story and you go, and Jesus said another time, the night before he dies on the cross, and then 3 days later rises again from the dead, the single most important moment in all of history, he asked these same three guys to hang out with him and be there for him because he's not feeling good and things are heavy and bad and everything else. And he says, and he comes back, each time he comes back to them after he goes to pray, they're sleeping. In other words, yes, I know some of you are sleeping right now. It's okay. It's okay. I get it. You know why you do that? Because you're human. Jesus pegged it. He said to them at that time, he said, you know, your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. You ever felt that stuff before? You ever felt, man, yes, I want to connect with God. I want to have this meaningful thing going on, but, and that's it. I love it. I had a season in my life where I got to hang out with people from the Chinese underground church. I mean, these are amazing people. I got to go to a leadership conference that was for leaders in the underground church in China. I met a guy personally who still had the cuts on his wrist. He had just been released from jail. There were cuts on his wrist from the handcuffs that he had been on. He had been in jail for preaching Jesus. I mean, this is intense, amazing stuff. And I was sitting there in one of their conferences, and this guy's preaching in Chinese. I didn't know what they were saying, but man, I could tell it was intense. It was great. And I looked over to my right, and I love it because there was one guy just sitting there. These amazing, amazing people falling asleep during services. You're dust, and God remembers your dust. Why am I bringing that up? Because we need to embrace our humanity. We're physical beings. We're emotional beings. We need to eat right. We need to exercise. We need to get the right amount of sleep. Sometimes we want desperately to do things that we can't quite pull off. It doesn't stop there. It says that Peter, he does wake up. He wakes up. That's what woke them up was the bright lights and there's Moses and Elijah. And then he comes up. He's one of those a true extrovert is someone who thinks it, and if they think it, they say it. They just think it and say it. So he comes up and his plan is, oh, wow, it's really good to be here. Hey, I've got an idea. Why don't I make a tabernacle for you and for Moses and Elijah? And that's a plan. I can almost picture Moses and Elijah going like, who's that guy? What's he doing following you? It had to be kind of funny. And then it says that the cloud at that point, basically the implication is it interrupted him while he was saying this stuff. The cloud, God himself of the universe, where the voice is coming from, interrupts Peter. Doesn't even acknowledge that he said anything, because it does say in the passage, he said it because he didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know what he was saying. He was just saying stuff. He's us. And then the cloud comes down. Now I want you to remember something. You're human. And where the whole process of restoration began, we introduced you to this concept in the Bible called lamenting. That if you've had a rough year, and we've had people who have lost loved ones, we have people who have lost businesses, some people have lost relationships, some have just gone through all the uncertainty that brings so much anxiety. You know how you begin the process of being restored. You acknowledge you're human, you remember He knows your dust, and you say things like, God, I lost relationships. God, I lost my business. We got hit financially. I lost this person in my life due to COVID. It's been a rough year, and that's where you begin the journey. You start right where you are. Why? Because He remembers your dust. Embrace your humanity. That's not an excuse to do a bunch of immoral things, but it's okay to be like these guys here and just be a person in the middle of amazing things that God is doing. Let's do one more. If you want to be restored, make your ambition greater revelation. Make your ambition greater revelation. In the end, that's what this passage is obviously all about. I mean, you look at the text, what it's doing is Jesus has them identify Him first, and they do identify Him as the Christ of God. That's the first thing that happens. And then Jesus says, yes, you got that right, good answer. But then immediately He starts dismantling all their wrong perceptions about it. And what this is okay, I'm gonna take you from, you've got this idea of what it means to be the Messiah and the Christ and all that, but now I'm gonna show you the real stuff. I'm gonna show you that I'm on a glory level, and I'm going to reveal to you about who I am on a level that you can't even begin to process. We're going to give it to you anyway. By the way, that's one of the things I love about this story is that even though these guys were sleeping and they were weak and they didn't know what to say, the experience happened anyway. God gave it to them anyway. And what did He give them? Well, there's a lot of talk about glory in there. It says Moses and Elijah showed up and they had glory, and then Jesus had glory. And this cloud that comes down, the implication is this glory cloud. What does that mean? Well, we've covered this a number of times, but if you haven't been with us before, glory in the Bible, the word literally is a combination of brightness or light and weight. Light and weight. Because light implies, his clothes were gleaming. There was light coming out of him. The Bible says that God dwells in unapproachable light. And so light has this sense of purity and power. Imagine getting in a spaceship and heading towards the sun, and you just get closer and closer and closer and closer to it. You would just perceive it as nothing but brightness and power and amazing kind of stuff. So there's light and weight. Now, I don't mean literal weight. I mean weight of importance. It's kind of this sense of someone who's got a lot of dignity, and you see them come in. I happened to, my wife and I were dropping one of my daughters off years ago at the Evansville airport to go visit a relative down in Florida. And I just lucked out. I happened to be there at the same hour where Air Force One landed at the Evansville airport. This is back when Barack Obama was president, and we got to watch it come in. And this 747 just comes in over the building at this kind of small airport. It was amazing to see. It wasn't only amazing because it was 747, which was enough. It was Air Force One. And then on the ground, there were all these military vehicles and limousines and everything. That's weight. That's kind of this sense of this is important. This is a big deal. So Moses and Elijah are there, and they have a glory, it says. They have a brightness. They have a weightiness. Now, scholars debate a lot about why Moses and Elijah. And there's a lot of theories out there. Of those theories, I pick the one that, for one, that Moses, in a Jewish mind, if you looked up and you were Peter or somebody, he was to them the heaviest one, outside of maybe Abraham, but he was the lawgiver. He was the one that really revealed God to them up until that point. And then Elijah was really, they considered in their mind, the most powerful prophet of all. Some compare him to Jesus himself in terms of power. He did miracles of healing like Jesus did. We don't know all the reason, but we do know one thing, that they had a glory and they were there and they were standing with Jesus doing this. And then this bright light comes on and all this sort of thing. So there's that part of the revelation. And then the cloud comes. And what does the cloud say? This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. And this, it records that these guys were going to this cloud and they were absolutely terrified. But the voice was saying, this is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. Now, as I've kind of just grappled with the thought of how can you be restored in your soul? I've watched Jesus' life, and we've come down on forgiveness, and we've talked about identity, and we've talked about a number of different things. The thing that I come back to the most, and this is what comes in the conclusion, the thing that I see the most is that the greatest thing that you can do in the midst of confusion, in the midst of heartache, in the midst of not knowing up from down in your life is to make your ambition a greater revelation of who Jesus is. Because let's face it, many of us, we still wrestle with what I would call a very Sunday school image of Jesus. Yeah, he's the guy in the white robe, and he's got the beard, and he walks around, and he's nice to people, and we know he fed 5,000, and he calmed a storm, and we do treat it that, and he's the one that doesn't want us to do bad things and wants us to do good things and all that sort of business. One of the greatest transformations I got to have mentally and otherwise was they made me in college watch a video series of a scholar whose main point was Jesus is not the Lord of just the religious realm or the spiritual realm and what we associate with religion. You've got to understand that he is the Lord of it all. He is the maker of everything. He is the one that put the mystery and the power in black holes and quasars. He put the cuteness in puppies. He put the fun in popcorn. He put the breath that you breathe and made it available to you. He put it all there. He is the Lord of all things. He is the maker of all things. And that's what they were being shown. This is his glory. This is my son. This is the one I'm revealing. Listen. So get a greater view of him and listen. Get a greater view of him and listen. See, they always start it with identity. Rightly identify him and then listen to him. Because it makes sense logically that if you rightly identify him, you listen to him and you let him be the guide of your relationships, your finances, your values, your time, your direction, it all. Now here's what we're doing going forward. We are closing this series out. But we're going to pick up the study of Luke and it'll go on a while. Because I believe with all the chaos that's going on in our culture and the arguments and the cultural civil war and that whole bit that's going on right now, if you want to keep your sanity, if you want to keep your sense about what's really right, identify him well and listen to him. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Make him your obsession. And we're going to do a series called Overcoming Heard It All Beforeism. Because these stories like the feeding of 5,000 and the transfiguration, it can easily slide into this just religious little cartoon that we have in our minds. And we need to actively make it our ambition to have a greater revelation of who he is. Because that's the thing that's going to put your soul together more than any other single thing in all of life. Now here's how I want to close out. I want to ask you across all of our campuses to stand to your feet. And if you're at home watching online, if you don't feel awkward, you can stand to your feet. But we're going to do something that Christians back in the first centuries of the church did. We've introduced this in the Bible, in the book of Colossians is the greatest description, I believe, of Jesus' identity in all of the Bible. It's kind of I would call it a verbal version of what we just saw in the Transfiguration. But it's a creed that would have been recited or sung, they think, in early churches. And what I want us to do is simply is look up at these words and make it our commitment. Yeah, we need to plan. We need to plan to have our prayerful rest. We need to remember that we're dust. But we need to make it our ambition to have a greater revelation of who he is. So I want us just to read this out loud together, and then I'll pray, and we'll go. Read it with me. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Father, I ask you very simply to give us a greater revelation of who Jesus is, and may we see that and live it and listen to him. Empower our weak flesh, our dust. Empower our humanness in the face of it all. Help us to set aside time where you can do this kind of work, and forgive us when we're slow to do that. Give us that greater view of who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.